The air was freezing in the CBS Town Hall studio in Miami. The cameras were rolling, and the audience was in tune with the atmosphere. Everyone was completely focused. Two powerful figures stood under the stage lights, facing each other to debate modern America's understanding of justice. Before we get to this breathtaking debate, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more stories like this. Now, let's dive into the story. One of America's most famous judges, Judge Judy, brought her years of courtroom experience and tough demeanor on television to this debate. On the other side was NBA star Jimmy Butler, admired by millions, who appeared on screen tonight in a completely different role. Tonight, he was not just an athlete, but also an advisor on criminal justice policy, an advocate for young people, and a champion of justice reform. The title of the program was You, the State of Justice in America. You, the topic: mandatory minimum sentences and judicial discretion. The first few minutes passed calmly, but then the moment came. Jimmy took the microphone and said, "According to data we collected in Florida, when judges are given more discretion, there is a 38% difference in sentences for similar crimes. This greatly undermines public confidence in the system." Judge Judy took a deep breath. She focused her eyes on Jimmy and leaned forward with her usual confident demeanor. Taking a document from the folder in front of her, she began to speak in a rather loud voice. "Are you Mr. Jimmy Butler? I don't know how accurate the data you have is, but I am holding here the official 2023 report of the Florida Criminal Justice and Probation Board. According to this report, the overall sentencing disparity is only 17%. Moreover, this disparity is not due to arbitrary decisions by judges, but to differences in the criminal records of the defendants." A brief murmur filled the room as everyone whispered to one another. Jimmy paused briefly before regaining his composure. He took a deep breath and responded directly. "You, Judge Judy, what you are referring to is 17%, which is the state average. What I am referring to is a rate of 38%, which is particularly prevalent in large judicial districts with a high volume of drug trafficking cases. It is clearly stated on page 43 of the same report." Phew. Judge Judy's gaze suddenly hardened. "Oh, but you presented this rate as a generalization. You conveyed it to viewers without providing context. This is misleading to the public. You cannot defend such a sensitive issue with inaccurate information." Jimmy responded without lowering his voice for a moment. The issue at hand was drug-related crimes, and I intended to explain it within that specific context. However, I now understand that this point should have been made more clearly. These words further heated up the technical side of the debate, and the tension in the studio continued to rise. The program's moderator tried to intervene, but Judge Judy raised her hand slightly and continued speaking. "Mandatory minimum sentences take away judges' ability to consider individual circumstances. I have been in the justice system for 50 years. I can say this clearly. Preset penalties often bring injustice rather than justice." Jimmy Butler's response came with the weight of his own experience. "I respect you, Judge, but we see different things on the field. You know that I live in communities. I hear the stories of young people firsthand, and in many cases, I believe that criminals should be held accountable not only in court, but also before society. A fentanyl dealer who brutally murders 3 young people receives a light sentence, but an insurance fraudster can spend years in prison. Believe me, this does not seem like a fair punishment to me. Don't you agree?" Judge Judy shook her head slightly. "Of course, examples like these are very sad and shocking. But individual anecdotes are exceptions. You can't build a system based on exceptions like these. According to data from the National Justice Research Group, mandatory minimum sentences have caused the number of prisoners to increase by 500% since 1980. Despite this, there has been no significant decrease in crime rates today." Jimmy directly objected. "The source you're referring to is biased, and looking at the data alone is not enough. Crime rates are influenced by many factors, such as the economy, education, and social pressure." This was no longer an ordinary debate. The audience had also realized this. It had turned into a discussion not only about numbers and statistics, but also about ideologies, experiences, and human lives. Judge Judy delivered the final blow. You, Mr. Butler, during the period when you were a justice advisor, the prison population in Florida increased by 7%, yet crime rates were falling. Do you think this was a fair system? Jimmy's face suddenly took on a serious expression. Oh yes, it did increase, because these were not minor crimes. These people were convicted of serious crimes. And yes, that's why society became safer. Judge Judy placed the documents on the table. Oh, but what was the cost of that security? Florida spent an additional $1.2 billion on prisons during that period. If even half of that money had gone to rehabilitation and education programs, couldn't we have achieved more lasting solutions? Jimmy's voice came from deeper within this time. Judge, I didn't make these decisions on paper. I sat across from parents who lost their children to substance abuse. I had to tell that mother and father that the man who killed their daughter had been arrested 7 times before, but was released each time. That's when you can tell me what those numbers mean. At that moment, a tense silence fell over the studio. No data charts or percentages could convey the meaning of that silence. The silence that followed was so profound that even the cameras could be heard. Not a sound came from the hall. All the spectators held their breath, watching intently the 2 figures on stage. A female judge who had dedicated her life to the law, and a male athlete who had spent years competing on the field. But at that moment, they were more than just their titles. 2 people, 2 different perspectives, colliding within the same system. Jimmy Butler bowed his head. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his lips slightly parted. Then he slowly raised his head and looked into Judge Judy's eyes. Faced with her determined but fair demeanor, Jimmy began to speak, carefully weighing his words for the first time. Judge, I don't really like to talk about numbers, but sometimes you have to face the facts. Looking at those files, I felt very powerful, but looking at the faces of those parents, I've never felt so weak. Judge Judy looked at him for a moment. Then she put her documents aside, put down her pen, and leaned back in her chair. Her voice was softer and more questioning this time. Mr. Butler, allow me to ask you a different question. In the course of your work, has the mandatory minimum sentencing system, the system you are defending right now, ever produced a result that you felt was unjust? Once again, silence fell over the room. This question was not a challenge. It was also a good opportunity, and Jimmy realized this. He paused for a few seconds. Then he shook his head and slowly began to speak. His voice was low at first, but as he continued, he grew bolder. Yes, of course it has. In fact, there's one case I'll never forget. A young man, 22 years old, no criminal record. He was giving a friend a ride somewhere. That friend was selling drugs at the time. The young man was just there, so the system charged him with the same crime, and the amount was enough to trigger the sentence. 15 years. Mandatory and minimum. When I reviewed the case, I knew that the boy's role was much smaller, but unfortunately, there was nothing I could do. A few people in the courtroom leaned forward as if agreeing with him. Some were blinking at the screen. Jimmy's voice was louder this time. That day, I realized that justice isn't always black and white. Sometimes it's gray, and we know that in gray areas, if the laws are strict, even we, as human beings, are powerless. Judge Judy listened carefully to his answer. Then she shook her head slowly. That is exactly what I am trying to say, Mr. Butler. The law is not a machine. There are people involved, and there are lives at stake. That is why, no matter how well-intentioned a rule may be, its application requires thought, judgment, and even humanity. Jimmy internalized these words. However, he continued speaking without backing down. I still think the system needs a certain structure, of course. But maybe in some places, the pendulum has swung too far. It's not easy to say, but it's true. At that moment, Jimmy opened the file next to him. He took out a document and pushed it toward Judge Judy with an attachment. This document is a draft law that I supported during my last year in office. It proposed the creation of a AO safety valve, to to allow for exceptions to mandatory minimum sentences. For the first time, it would allow judges to reduce sentences for first-time offenders who committed nonviolent crimes. Unfortunately, it never came into effect, but my thoughts haven't changed since that day. Judge Judy put on her glasses and examined the document. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly and then returned to Jimmy. "Oh, you know what? Of course I would like to support this approach, but perhaps not by completely abolishing these rules, but by building a system that incorporates conscience, and that could truly be the foundation of justice." Ooh. The atmosphere in the hall softened at the speed of light. The tense debate that had been going on for some time had now evolved into mutual understanding. Then the moderator intervened. "Oh, then let me war. Qovas. Since you both seem to have found common ground on this issue, is this reform really feasible? In other words, can people from two different sides come together and create a new system? Vous, is this possible?" Judge Judy answered without a moment's hesitation. "Oh, we believe that Americans want a system that is both fair and effective. Neither completely automated punishment nor unchecked discretion is the answer." You, Jimmy, nodded in agreement. You, of course, public safety is still the top priority, but safety cannot be achieved through long sentences alone. It can be achieved through appropriate punishment. Ooh. And at that moment, the audience had already realized something. This scene was not just a clash of two ideas. It was also a scene of compromise, of changing minds, and most importantly, of courage. Millions of people watching their screens witnessed a real debate turn into a genuine confrontation, which went down in television history. When the program ended, the first thing that rose from the studio was loud applause. The applause was deafening. Of course, this was no ordinary ovation. Those who stood and applauded were not only applauding the intensity of the debate, but also its honesty, sincerity, and courageous confessions. Within hours, social media was ablaze. Ooh. Trending topic on Twitter: Judy Butler justice. The clip was posted on CNN's YouTube channel within minutes and reached over 1 million views in its first hour. Oh, this is real leadership. You changing. Your mind is not a sign of weakness, but an important sign of strength. You for the first time, a debate gave me hope. Some praised Jimmy, while others were impressed by Judy. But in the end, almost everyone agreed. This debate was a turning point. A couple of hours later, the country's biggest media outlets began featuring the program in their main news broadcasts. MSNBC said, there was no enemy, there was dialogue. The Washington Post ran the following headline the next day: the Judy Butler model, this is how debate should be. The editor's column stated, it is now possible to conduct debates not only with slogans, but also with concrete data and human experience. And this duo has shown us that. Jimmy Butler's team, could no longer keep up with the phone calls. Some wanted to invite him to their programs. Some offered him to participate in panels, and others just called to thank him. His public proposal for reform had caused a huge stir, especially among young people. That night, he posted a simple but striking message on his Instagram account. Learning from our mistakes is far better than stubbornly clinging to a wrong. Today, I took another step forward. I hope thousands will follow in my footsteps. At justice for all. On the other hand, Judge Judy was also shown great respect. All those who had been following her tough character on screen for years saw a side of her that was soft as a sponge, but still standing tall. And they realized once again that she was not just playing a role. In an interview with 60 Minutes, she said, Jimmy Butler surprised me a lot. But what I liked most was this: his willingness to question the system he defends. This is something very rare these days. If we, as public figures, are closed to change, how can we convince the public? The debate did not remain confined to the media and the public. 3 weeks later, an important announcement was made on Capitol Hill. Senator Dick Durbin and senators from both parties announced that they had drafted a new bill, Judicial Discretion and Public Safety Act. This bill was based on the safety valve model supported by Jimmy Butler and the human criteria, emphasized by Judge Judy in relation to the justice system. Durbin used the following words when explaining the bill they had prepared. This law might not have come up so quickly if it weren't for the live broadcast debate between Judy and Jimmy, but they fulfilled their responsibilities not only to each other, but to all of humanity. So much so that compromise is possible even when there are differences of opinion. We are continuing to move forward on this path. After the press conference, Jimmy made a brief statement. I am definitely not a lawmaker, but I am certain of one thing. If people within the system cannot communicate, those outside will only suffer. This bill was born from a single dialogue, and I hope it will be a start for other things. Judge Judy, of course, did not remain silent about this bill. She made the following statements at a legal forum she attended. Criminal justice reform is not about creating a system that only works in favor of criminals. It must also be fair to victims, judges, and most importantly, society. This bill is a very important step toward achieving that balance. The Georgetown Law Center has also added this program to its curriculum as a case study. Professor Michael Seidman said, "In this debate, both sides tried to argue not only with numbers, but also with emotions, and most importantly, they managed to take the other side's strongest argument into account. Our students definitely need to learn this." And of course, social scientists analyzed the event. Political psychologist Jonathan Haidt said in a TED Talk, that debate was not just good television. It was a live lesson in how democracy should work. Ideas clashed, but people did not. That's how real progress begins. These words actually summed up the whole story. Less than a month after the debate, the footsteps of change were becoming increasingly clear. Public pressure, media interest, and thousands of emails, letters, and signatures from the public had begun to shake the walls of politics. The judicial discretion and public safety law, had been added to the Senate's agenda. The bill aimed to reduce the severity of mandatory minimum sentences while allowing judges to make humanitarian assessments under certain conditions. Discussions had also heated up in the House of Representatives. A small number of MPs opposed the bill, arguing that it could embolden criminals. But the majority, like Judge Judy and Jimmy Butler, emphasized the importance of justice in gray areas. In addition, support from the public was growing in waves. Open sessions were held at law schools, panels were organized at universities, and campaigns were launched on social media channels. First of all, especially in the eyes of the younger generation, Jimmy Butler was no longer just a sports icon. He was also a figure who outspoke his mind, admitted his mistakes, and even thought for himself. A champion who speaks for society. A commendable transition from the basketball court to the law podium. A man who fearlessly changed his mind, inspiring all of humanity. But the big news was yet to come. About 6 months after the incident on the talk show, an announcement was made at a joint press conference. Judge Judy and Jimmy Butler will co-chair the Commission on Effective Punishment. The room was once again flooded with flashbulbs. The announcement everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. Judge Judy took the microphone and said, "It all started with a television broadcast, but we knew it wouldn't end here. This commission will bring together judges, prosecutors, former convicts, victims' families, and academics to chart a course for a more just system." When Jimmy Butler took the floor, the crowd fell silent. I'm not a lawyer, but I've seen injustice. I've seen pain. I've known young people whose lives were stolen right before my eyes. And now we want to do more than just talk. We want to take action. The commission's goals were clear: making prison sentences proportional, directing first-time offenders toward rehabilitation, granting judges a certain degree of flexibility, and protecting Social Security while also protecting the rights of victims. This was not just a technical commission, of course. It would also be a platform that worked with conscience. It was a structure that encompassed emotions, losses, mistakes, and hopes. As expected, Public interest did not wane in the weeks following the commission's launch. On the contrary, the media followed their every move with dedication and reported on developments as they unfolded in live broadcasts. Judge Judy's upright and disciplined character was balanced by Jimmy Butler's sincerity, and together with the other members of the team, a collective willpower was formed. One day, during an open session with students at a high school in Florida, a young girl asked Jimmy the following question. "Jimmy Butler, you are a very powerful person. But if a powerful person does something wrong, can they admit that it was wrong and apologize?" Jimmy smiled slightly for a moment. His eyes also gazed into the distance. Then he turned back to the high school girl and looked her in the eyes. A strong person is not strong because they defend what is right, but because they can turn back when they realize they are wrong. Apologizing, changing direction, or thinking are all acts of strength. And since you asked me this question, you are already a strong girl. These words, which touched the little girl, hit the headlines the next day like a bolt of lightning. And in fact, it was as if they summed up the story. When a person changes their mind, they are not weak. They become open to thinking. When a judge softens, they do not stray from justice. They become closer to people. When a country debates, it never divides. On the contrary, it seeks solutions. While the Commission's first draft report was being prepared, social media campaigns were gaining momentum. School children were filming and posting videos with the hashtag #JusticeWithJudgment, and the following sentence was written on public billboards in different cities. Justice is not only concerned with crime, but also with people. This sentence was no longer just a slogan. It had become a summary of a call, a transformation, and a revolution in understanding. It was the theme of rap songs, graffiti on classroom walls, and a voice echoing in protests. The idea that justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but also about healing the conscience of society. As expected, Jimmy Butler often met with young people outside of commission meetings and mentored neighborhood kids who were trying to stay out of trouble. Because for Jimmy, this issue was no longer a debate, but a personal responsibility. The discipline he learned on the basketball court was now guiding him in the arena of social justice. On the other hand, Judge Judy, before setting aside her sharp judgment gained over the years, was sincerely open to new ideas. One day she turned to Jimmy behind the camera and said, Jimmy, I think I've changed. Maybe not all of my ideas, but the way I defend them has changed a lot. I try to remember more often that there are lives behind the numbers, and that's one of the most valuable things I've learned, even if it's too late." Jimmy nodded and simply replied, "That's why I have endless respect for you, Your Honor. If a system can keep a judge's conscience fresh, then that system can still be saved." The Commission's first report was a comprehensive 178-page document. It included the following main headings: providing judges with a safety valve, clarifying the conditions under which they can deviate from the mandatory minimum, alternative sentencing programs for first-time offenders, reorganization of prisons, and increase in rehabilitation centers, strengthening victim support units, creating job and educational opportunities for the reintegration of prisoners. The report was published nationwide. Jimmy and Judge Judy took the stage together. Under the bright spotlights, the scene was almost a continuation of the debate 6 months earlier. But this time, instead of a fight, they stood together. Judge Judy reached for the microphone first. These recommendations are not perfect, of course, but they are an important first step. We may still think differently, but we are here to serve the same purpose: a fairer system. And justice, when these two come together, requires balance, not sides. The microphone was now with Jimmy. He took the floor and said, yes, this document was not written just for lawyers. It was written for the children growing up in our neighborhoods. It was written for a system based on second chances, not criminal records. It was written for everyone who has committed a crime and wants to turn their life around, but finds doors closed to them. We wrote it together, and we must stand together. Ooh. The press described this moment as a U-turning point in the history of modern justice. A few weeks later, the bill was presented to Congress and passed with debate but broad support. For the first time in the United States, a federal law allowing for the relaxation of mandatory minimum sentences came into effect. Jimmy Butler continued his basketball career during this process, of course. But now, after every three-pointer he scored on the court, a different voice rose from the stands. "Oh, justice with judgment." You, the new generation, knew him not only as an athlete, but also as someone who used his voice for the people. Judge Judy, meanwhile, had entered perhaps the calmest, quietest, but most effective period of her career. The guests she invited to her shows were no longer just names that would spark debate, but real people who had experienced change. She showed that justice should focus on the truth, not the cameras. Some societies sometimes achieve change not through fighting, but through talking. People should not be afraid of ideas, but of a lack of conscience. What a system needs to survive is not just strict rules, but an understanding built on human conscience. That is why the stories of Judge Judy and Jimmy Butler will never be forgotten. The reason is that they sat down at the same table, even though they were not alike, because one was powerful because of his age, and the other because of his name. And together, they reminded millions of us that true justice does not come from silent people, but from societies that think and act on their convictions. If you are interested in stories like this, and are open to this kind of discussion, don't forget to click the subscribe button below and activate the bell icon.